We're live. Over to you, Kent.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, folks, for our 2023 boot camp. We are here at Dinosaur Adventureland in Lenox, Alabama, where God gets the glory for his creation instead of the stupid evolution religion, and it's nothing but a religion. And thank you, Donnie, for letting us use your channel tonight for this one. There's a war going on, folks. Get involved. Do something. I mean, get equipped, get involved, do something, okay? Get informed about the enemy. Who is the enemy? Well, it's Satan, but he's using people who are teaching this dumb religion of evolution to draw people away from God, okay? What do? Well, build your strength, build your skills, find out what God's equipped you with, and do it. Learn more about it. Maybe you like to do stuff on biology. Okay, make that your specialty. Maybe it's plants. Maybe it's one-armed octopus. I don't know. Find something, build your weapon, and do something with it. Learn what your weapon is, the Bible. Learn that Bible, learn real science, and it'll defeat evolution every time. Evolution is not science, it's a religion. If you can't shoot, at least you can carry ammo for the ones who will. If you know somebody that's if I had a good sniper on my team and he was doing a good job, I'd spend my time carrying water to him, carrying ammo, rub his feet, do something, bring him his breakfast, keep him shooting. He's good at it. Keep him on the firing line. All right. If you can't shoot or carry ammo, then help pay for it. Some of you are good at making money, real good at it. Great. That's not so you can get a new Rolls Royce every year. It's so you can help support ministries, do something with the money, okay? Or take care of the wounded. There's a lot of Christians that need some help getting back in the battle, right? Can't you see anything that needs done? There's a war going on. Some people, I don't see anything that needs to be done. I'll just sit here and play my video game all day. Okay. I don't know. Anyway, don't fight your allies. Keep the focus on the common enemy. And there's a common enemy. Sometimes you got to ally with people you don't agree with on everything. That's okay. Don't fear the enemy soldiers who imagine they came from a rock and are related to a strawberry. There's nothing to fear from them. Learn this enemy soldiers' weapons are pure imagination so you can defeat them. They're shooting soap bubbles, folks. Pop them and keep going. Tonight we're going to have Donnie at Standing For Truth and Matt talk about the biology and genetics. Does that really support evolution? No. You need to learn what they're about to teach you here, folks. Write this down, take notes, and use this. You kids in public school, teachers are going to bamboozle you with the big fancy words. Wow, endogenous retroviruses. Whoa, got to be true. Study their weapon. It's nothing but soap bubbles. Donnie, thank you so much. Take it away. Tell us what you guys got prepared for tonight on genetics and how it proves creation, not evolution. Thank you, brother.
Well, thank you very much, Kent. Dr. Kent, the science gent, for the intro. I'm looking forward to this presentation. I got to say, before Matt and I start presenting, it's been an excellent boot camp so far. So boot camp 2023 has been a hit. Taylor Kay's presentation earlier was fantastic. So Matt and I tonight, we're going to be giving a presentation titled How Genetics Confirms Special Creation. And so we're going to get into some pretty fascinating evidence for the Adam and Eve of the Bible.
Go for it.
Okay. Here we go. I'm going to share screen. And for the audience sake, what we are going to be doing is roughly 30 minutes each. And so I'll give the first 30 minutes. Matt, if you want to let me know if the slides are coming in, the audio is coming in. I think you're on mute, Matt. So maybe just give me the good to go. Good. Okay. All right, here we go. So I'll give the first 30 minutes, and then Matt will give the second 30 minutes. And then if Kent's audience or anybody in the chat had questions, we could take a few minutes for that as well. Okay, so let's get started. I'm looking forward to this. So a case for separate ancestry. How genetics confirms biblical creation. Boot Camp 2023. It's been a great conference so far. So this specific 30 minutes, the first 30 minutes is going to be presented by me, Donnie Budinsky. I'm the founder of Standing For Truth Ministries. We've been doing full-time ministry now for about 3 or 4 years. And within those 3 or 4 years, we've written several books. Here's a couple that are relevant to tonight's topic. And so this is a comprehensive book, Special Creation, Dismantling Evolution and Confirming Independent Origins. And so I wrote this with the intention in mind, basically, to provide people with the most up-to-date book on all of your ancestry related topics. And so this gets into mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Noah, it gets into Neanderthals and human evolution, endogenous retroviruses, which we will be discussing tonight. So I highly recommend checking out that book. Also, the Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook. And so I've written a specific book dealing with that topic. Since over the last year or two, many of your prominent evolutionists on YouTube, they've put out videos arguing that ERVs are just irrefutable evidence that we're related to fish and banana plants. And so I decided to take them to task and wrote an extensive book on that topic. Again, we'll be discussing that in detail tonight. And I've also written a book on end times, going through the tribulation, the rapture, so on and so forth, advancing a very similar model to Dr. Dino. We've also got a website, so standingfortruthministries.com. There's a lot on this website. So if you go to the homepage and look to the right, there's dozens and dozens of just common questions. Did dinosaurs and man coexist? What's the evidence for the flood? Also, refuting critics such as Aaron Ra and Simon Dan and so on and so forth. So make sure to take advantage of the website where you can find plenty of videos, articles, past conferences that we've done, and so on. Okay, let's get right into it. Firstly, I want to say it's a privilege and also an honor to be speaking at Dr. Hovind's boot camp this year. I have been saved for roughly 8 years, and Kent's work was a powerful reason for my conversion. His seminar series, his countless debates. I'm working hard to catch up to Kent. I've done about 100 formal debates. Kent's done about 320. So he's in the lead by far so far. And so his debates, his seminars, his videos really helped open my eyes to the truth of Christianity and the saving gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I really want to thank him for that. It's definitely been an adventure the last 7 or 8 years, discovering all of the amazing evidence for special creation, all the evidence against fish to fisherman evolution. I'm very excited tonight, Matt and I both, to be presenting on special creation and separate ancestry. The good news is that there is ample evidence for special creation and also a literal Adam and Eve. We've actually discovered the first couple, Adam and Eve, in genetics, and we're going to cover some of that evidence tonight. Now, unfortunately, I won't be able to cover all this evidence in this short talk. The hour that Matt and I have will most certainly not be sufficient to cover this amazing evidence in its entirety, which is why I've recommended the books prior to this slide, where you'll find just comprehensive breakdowns on all of these topics. Okay, so the following are a couple mottos that I think we could all live by. I first heard these from Dr. John Sanford. He's the author of the Evolution Dismantling book, a book I highly recommend titled Genetic Entropy, the fact that mutations are accumulating in genomes of living organisms and that most mutations are deleterious. And so genomes are degrading. Genomes are going downhill rather than uphill, which is what large-scale evolution would require. So I think these couple quotes to get us started really help to convey or capture truth. And these are mottos that we should all embrace. And so firstly, believe God more and believe man less. And I can tell you from thoroughly studying these topics, good science always affirms Scripture. Genesis, the Bible claims to be the history book of the universe. And so we should be able to test its claims, not that it needs any testing, but we can test its claims. How Genesis says that God created Adam and Eve in the beginning. From the beginning of creation, he made them male and female. It wouldn't make any sense if we had millions to billions of years and then the creation of man. No, Jesus Christ is referring back to the creation week, and he is saying he made them male and female in the beginning, Adam and Eve. And so this is important. As you're going to see, good science always affirms Scripture. Now, there are some significant implications, which is why we need to take Genesis as a literal history. The biblical Adam and Eve are the sole ancestors of every single person who has ever lived. This comprises both the sole genetic and sole genealogical ancestors. and the existence of our first parents has significant implications on the gospel message. If there was no first Adam, then what is the necessity of the last Adam? If Adam did not really exist, then why did Jesus die for the sins of the world? And so again, Genesis claims to be the history book of the universe. And so we should be able to look at the empirical scientific data. I'm talking about good science, not the kind of science that says whales and pine trees are related, but good empirical science, science that we can test, science that we can observe, science that we can retest, and science that allows us to make testable predictions. And so we'll start with Genesis 2:7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And so here we have God creating the first man, Adam. Genesis 2:21-22. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. And he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib, which the Lord God had taken from man, made he a woman and brought her unto the man. So here we have Eve, the mother of all living. And so there's no hint at all of shared relationship with chimpanzees. Adam and Eve were created special and also independent or separate from any other form of life. And that's exactly what we mean by separate ancestry, is the fact that we believe God created original kinds and they are not related to each other. Obviously, we have groups that do go back to a common ancestor, but we'd argue God created the dog kind, for example, the cat kind, and Adam and Eve, separate from the great apes. So notice Genesis 5:2, male and female created he them. Mark 10:6, from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. Genesis 3:20, and Adam called his wife's name Eve, and she was the mother of all living. 1 Corinthians 15 is clear. Adam was the first man. And so I'm here to tell you that there is plenty of scientific evidence that confirms the account of origins that we just read about in Genesis. And for sake of time, I'll be covering just 4 of those lines of evidence. So we'll be covering mitochondrial Eve, the fact that we can trace all mitochondrial DNA worldwide that's inherited on the mother's side. That's why it's referred to as uniparentally inherited DNA, because it's only passed down from one side, maternally. And all mitochondrial DNA can be traced back to one single woman who lived in the not so distant past. We've also got Y chromosome Adam or Noah. The reason why we would more accurately say Y chromosome Noah is because the last universal Y chromosomal ancestor, again, the Y chromosome is passed down uniparentally, but this time it's on the father's side. And so every single male Y chromosome on the planet, whether it's my Y chromosome, Matt's Y chromosome, Dr. Hoven's Y chromosome, they are nearly identical. There exists low genetic variation within Y chromosomes, and every single Y chromosome can be traced back to a single male Y chromosomal ancestor just 4,500 years ago. Well, that fits the Bible's account of origins perfectly, because 4,500 years ago, we had a flood bottleneck where the earth was repopulated by Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we have an echo of that in genetics. We'll also touch briefly on genetic entropy, which I touched on briefly just a few minutes ago, the accumulation of deleterious mutations, the fact that man has accumulated a very high genetic load. And this genetic load actually puts shelf lives on genomes, which means species cannot persist for millions of years into the future, and therefore could not have persisted for millions of years into the past, and thereby falsifying evolutionism. And we'll also touch on design diversity. The fact that the evidence suggests Adam and Eve, when they were created with pre-existing diversity and the ability to adapt. This also applies universally to the created kinds, where they have the pre-existing ability to adapt. And there's plenty of evidence for this in the world of DNA function. So here's a few slides that I'm just going to quickly go through. The separate ancestry model. This is what I was touching on briefly. And the fact that we have humans on one side, as you can see, Adam and Eve, going back to today, humans today, extant humans. They're separate from your other forms of life, including your great apes, orangutan, gorillas, chimpanzees, so on and so forth. And this is an important position to start from, because as I pointed out earlier, the existence of a historical Adam and Eve is incredibly important theologically. We know that sin exists, and we know the reason death has come into this world is because of sin. We are dead in Adam, but we can be alive in the last Adam, who is Jesus Christ. Salvation comes through Jesus Christ, and the necessity of salvation comes because of what Adam and Eve, our first parents, did in the garden. We are experiencing today the effects of the fall, the effects of that decision: death, degeneration, pain, suffering, and extinction. Death, of course, did not exist prior to sin and prior to the fall. And the Bible has incredibly important implications on the reality of our first parents. And that's why I believe this talk is very important, as it touches on the authority of Scripture. And it also touches on good science. Now, if we get rid of the historical Adam, as many theistic evolutionists unfortunately have done, many Bible compromisers, we generate some very major theological difficulties. There is absolutely no reason, guys, and I'm here to tell you today during this presentation in Dr. Dino's 2023 boot camp, there's no need to compromise the Bible. The Bible is true. God's word can be trusted. Now, when comparing the evolutionary model to the creation model, the evolutionists, they'll believe, as many people have seen in the countless debates that have been hosted on the Standing For Truth channel with Kent, we put on, Kent and I, Evolution Debate Challenge Series in 2022. And Dr. Dino definitely set some records by doing between 60 and 70 debates in a single year. And the challenge was basically put out to the evolutionary community. You guys believe and want us to believe that you're related to starfish, that we're related to mushrooms, sponges, green algae. Therefore, show up to a debate and give us your best evidence for such a thing. And so we did that challenge. Many people seen evolutionists admit that they are related to strawberries. They believe they're related to apples. They're related to walking sticks, fish. And so you can see the universal common ancestry model as compared to the creation model that has God creating separate kinds unrelated to each other. The evolutionary model has every single form of life, whether it's a bird, whether it's an elephant, whether it's an octopus, a snail, a human. All forms of life go back to a single common ancestor billions of years ago, as you can see at the base of the tree. This is a more sophisticated phylogenetic tree that's saying the same thing. You can have a few lines or you can have many lines. It's not going to change the fact that the evolutionists significantly lack evidence to say that we're related to fish and strawberries. One thing I've noticed about the evolutionists is they're really vague when it comes to the word evolution. And so this is why I think it's important that we define terms before we get into any debate or discussion with an evolutionist. Because if by evolution you mean change over time, we're not going to disagree. Cell phones change over time, organisms change over time, cars change over time. Change over time is real. Change over time is a reality. But if by evolution you mean, and this is what the evolutionists mean, that banana plants, dogs, whales, and flowers are all related through common ancestry, well, that's where creationists like Matt, myself, Dr. Dino would disagree. So yes, if you're going to say that all dogs go back to a wolf-like common ancestor, sure, that's science. But if you're going to say that dogs ultimately go back to a single-celled like ancestor billions of years ago, that, my friend, is not science. And so that's why we would argue that fish to fisherman evolution, or bacteria-like biology, or bacteria-like organism to biologists, it's evolution, it's a fairy tale. And their God is time. They'll admit, yes, today we see dogs producing a variety of dogs because all organisms have pre-existing diversity and the ability to vary from generation to generation. That's why a single couple, a married couple, could hypothetically have 1 million kids, and every single child would be different. They'd have different traits, different features. Their genetics would be different due to the shuffling of DNA variants every single generation. That's because we today have pre-existing diversity that allows us to vary. Now, not as much as Adam and Eve would have had, because there's been a sorting out process since since the creation. But the evolutionists want to say, well, the reason why we only see dogs producing dogs, the reason why we see humans producing humans, fish producing fish, is because we need time. We need time to see those large scale complex changes. And so that's why the God of the evolutionists is time. Now, I got to say, I borrowed this from Kent because I think it nails it perfectly. To the evolutionist, if I told you that Superman could fly quickly through the air, you'd say that's silly. That's a fairy tale. That's comic book stuff. But if I told you Superman could fly slowly through the air, now, according to the evolutionists, that's science. No, whether it's Superman flying through the air or Mary Poppins flying through the air with her umbrella, slowly or quickly, they're both fairy tales. And so evolution doesn't happen quickly. Evolution also doesn't happen slowly. Evolutionists, as a matter of fact, they hope, they dream, they imagine. They argue that time will basically solve all their problems, but more time is not the solution. It's not the hero of the plot, because more time means more degradation, more extinction, more mutation accumulation. So hypothetically, the evolutionists can have 10 trillion years and you're never going to take a single-celled like ancestor into a whale. So there's what's called differentiating lines of evidence, and chicken and egg problems, for example. And so this one slide, real quick, I could go over 10 to 20 of these examples that preclude evolution from being true. So here's just one. And here's the question: what came first, DNA or the repair enzymes that are necessary to maintain DNA? And so for a little context, we have over 1 million DNA breaks in our cells every single day. Thank God we are amazingly designed with these highly intricate DNA repair enzymes. And so when these DNA breaks occur, we have DNA enzymes that are front loaded into the cell by God to correct or fix these mistakes. But the problem for the evolutionists is DNA, or the repair enzymes that I'm talking about, they're necessary to maintain DNA. But you need both at the same time, because the information for the DNA repair enzymes, they're actually encoded into the DNA itself. So the DNA repair enzymes and the DNA, they must have been created at the same time. Just like Genesis says, everything was created very good. The complexities of life did not evolve from inadequacies to what we see today. No, this has to be true simultaneously, or else living things don't exist. Real briefly, I'm going to go through some of the agnostic evidence for evolution and creation. And so what I mean by agnostic is, when it comes to the origins debate, you've got creation, you've got evolution. If me as a creationist, if I were to argue, well, creation's true because the sky is blue or the earth is round. Sorry, flat earthers, but the earth is round. The evolutionists would say, well, what in the world? How is that evidence for creation? Because evolution can also explain why the sky is blue or the earth is round. And so it's agnostic to the overall debate. And the best way to refute evolution would be to look to what's called differentiating lines of evidence, evidence that only creation can explain. And that's why I focused on just one of the many chicken and egg problems that only the creation model could explain. So here's a few, what I would argue are agnostic lines of evidence for evolution. But unfortunately, in the debate, many evolutionists, they're constantly looking to these lines of evidence to say that we're related to fish. So there's classification systematics, there's homology, right? Shared structures in the biological world. There's nested hierarchies. The evolutionists will say, well, common descent's true because humans share more with the chimpanzees than they do with monkeys and dogs and banana plants. And so they argue there's a hierarchical pattern in the biological world. And then they'll look to what's called transitional fossils, basically groups of organisms that share distinct features from different groups of organisms. They'll look to Tiktaalik, for example, the famous fishapod. So we'll address these in turn. Firstly, classification systematics, it's arbitrary. Everybody knows the Linnaeus taxonomy: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Well, firstly, as Kent likes to point out, and he's absolutely right, The animals don't really care where we put them, where we classify them. All we're doing is taking certain traits, certain characteristics, whether it's through morphology, anatomy, genetics, or physiology, and putting creatures into groups. Well, we do the same thing when it comes to modes of transportation. We do the same thing with our tools. We can do it with our books. You know, upstairs in my main book shelf or cabinet, I have my books laid out in certain orders: theology books, science books, so on and so forth. And so we categorize all things. But what the evolutionist wants to do is they want to draw a circle so big that you can incorporate just about anything. And so here's a few examples just to show how ridiculous evolutionary classification schemes are. So if we drew a circle and titled that circle or labeled that circle things that can breathe. Okay, well, we've got babies, we've got lions, we've got gorillas, bats, we've got the platypus. Does this prove that they're all related? No, it just proves that somebody's got a little too much time on their hands and they want to spend their days and nights classifying things. What about things that are affected by gravity? We've seen many evolutionists repeat the R and Raw talking point that whales and pine trees are related because both are eukaryotes. They have an internal nucleus. Okay, well, both whales and pine trees are affected by gravity. So that must mean that they're related too. Or whales, pine trees, and bowling balls are affected by gravity. And so again, if we made a circle and titled it or labeled it things affected by gravity, you can get bowling balls in there. You put humans, chairs, shoes. Again, it doesn't prove anything. It's all arbitrary. It's all very subjective. We do the same thing with motorized transportation. And so you can classify vehicles that would share characteristics with sedans. And you can have a sedan category. You can have a hatchback category, an SUV category. It doesn't prove that they evolved ultimately over a common Arctic sedan ancestor. And so here's more examples, man-made classification systems. So now moving on to homology, so-called transitional forms, and nested hierarchy. So at the bottom, you can see homologous structures, right? You've got the forearm bone, basically shared humans, cats, whales, bats. You've got these interesting mosaics with tiktaalik platypus. Today, the living platypus would be an example of a living mosaic. The problem is the common design model actually better explains the homologous patterns that we see today. And so the model that Matt and I defend, we start from Genesis. God claims to have created man and created man in his image. And so if that's true, if we're created in the image of God, we should be able to get a sense for how God created by the way we create things, because there must be something about us that reflects the design. And so when we look to the biological world and we see homologous patterns, we see nested hierarchical patterns, we see interesting mosaics, but then also look to what human engineers design. Human engineers design in homologous patterns. This is good design. All types of vehicles, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in America, whether it's over in Asia, they all share certain characteristics. They tires, windshields, steering wheels in common, so on and so forth. So this is good design. We've also got the invention of crossover SUVs. We've got all sorts of vehicles that are very hard to classify. An SUV is, in a way, that perfect vehicle for somebody who doesn't really want a van, but they also don't want an SUV. And so you can get what's called a crossover. For example, here you can see the Dodge Journey, Ford Flex, Jeep Gladiator. It's got shared characteristics of a truck and a Jeep. The military, they've designed something called a military amphibious assault vehicle. That's not necessarily built just for the land. It's not necessarily built just for the sea, but it's built for the transitional environment between sea and land. And so a vehicle like this shares characteristics from a military sea vehicle and also a military land vehicle. And so again, this is good design. If evolution were true, there should be just countless. There should be tens of thousands of interesting mosaics in the fossil record to argue that basically we've evolved from single-celled like organisms, fish or farm fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals. And so we should find dozens and dozens and dozens of these interesting transitional forms, which we don't find. We find a few interesting mosaics that's consistent with the design hypothesis. And so what the evolutionists will do is they'll take advantage of the fact that the fossil record or the pre-flood world was a lot more diverse than today. And so what we're looking at in terms of the fossil record and today with extant organisms is pre and post-flood diversity. And so the evolutionists, they want to line things up. They like to play games, right? Classify things, line things up. And so technically, if I took a military sea vehicle, as you can see, the boat, or a tank built for the land, and then just threw that military amphibious assault vehicle right in the middle, this is how the evolutionists portray the evolutionary process. Lining things up doesn't provide evidence for fish to fisherman evolution. You'll oftentimes hear, well, we predicted to find, something like Tiktaalik, even though years later, after they found Tiktaalik, they found tetrapod foot tracks in Poland that predate Tiktaalik, according to the evolutionary model, by millions of years. So no, failed prediction for the evolutionary model, because that says that tetrapods existed before Tiktaalik. So it's not transitional. But what they'll say is, well, we predicted these transitionals. That's very similar to me saying, okay, we have a four-wheeler, as you can see in the picture. We've also got a unicycle and a bicycle. And so I predict we're going to find something with 3 wheels, a tricycle. And lo and behold, we find a tricycle, line them up. And again, it's not proving anything. Okay, so we've dealt with so-called transitional forms, classification, systematics, and homology. Let's look to nested hierarchies. The fact that humans can be grouped with humans, and they can now look at characteristics in, let's say, the great apes or other primates, and then incorporate them closer to humans than something like a fish or a dolphin. And so overall, it's just saying that humans, all you got to do is stand back and look at a human and a banana plant. And it doesn't take a genius to conclude that, yeah, there's probably some more similarities with a chimpanzee than a banana plant. And so if you're looking at the slide here, the picture, is it really any surprise that the human on the far right would share more with the chimpanzee in morphology and anatomy than a human and a salamander, or a human and a fish, even before we had genetic sequencing capabilities, right? We have some really sophisticated ways to compare genomes. And even before we had that, just stand back, look at the overall form of a chimpanzee and the overall form of a fish, and you could probably predict, yeah, we're probably going to have a few genes in common with the chimpanzee that we don't have in common with fish. And so we can do the same thing with man-made things. Notice here, sedans share more with other vehicles with 4 wheels, like an SUV or a truck, than they do with airplanes, or they do with bicycles or a skateboard. And so sure, once you start looking at traits and grouping certain vehicles in, like sedans, SUVs, tractor trailers, semi-tractor trailers, then sure, you're going to have this nested hierarchical pattern, but it's evidence of design, hierarchies by design rather than descent. And I would argue that it's reflective of God's hierarchical nature. You could do the same thing with your tools in your work shed. And there's some very hard to classify tools as well. Look to the right here. We got fencing pliers. And so fencing pliers are actually designed with a multi-purpose design that incorporates a staple puller, fencing wire. It's got all types of features to it. And so the evolutionists, they're going to have a great time with this. They're going to take your fencing pliers and they're going to line up a bunch of tools, and they're going to put it somewhere in the middle and say one transitioned into the other. And so as you can see, none of these lines of evidence actually provide good argumentation for common descent. These observations fit far better within a common design perspective. Okay, now I quickly want to move on to design diversity. And so this model would suggest that Adam and Eve and the original created kinds, when they were created and God said to be fruitful and multiply, it wouldn't make any scientific or theological sense to have created Adam and Eve with no diversity. In technical terms, that's called homozygosity. Homozygosity just means a state of no DNA diversity. That wouldn't make any sense, because then Adam and Eve would have just produced clones. And so it makes sense scientifically and theologically that God would have created Adam with pre-existing genetic diversity. And in technical terms, that just means heterozygosity, a state of DNA diversity. And a prediction of this model would actually be genetic function. And it turns out that we have amazing evidence for genome-wide functionality. And so when you look to the non-coding regions of the genome, evolutionists over time, they've assumed that a lot of those regions are junk. And this includes endogenous retroviruses. This includes pseudogenes. They look to endogenous retroviruses as being the ancient remnants of past viral infections. They look to pseudogenes, false genes, as basically being genetic mistakes. And they'll say, well, they used to be protein coding genes, but then they got hit with a mutation or something else happened that broke it. And so they say, well, those are shared between the chimpanzees and humans, and so we must have inherited them. But this is all based on a junk DNA assumption. Just like 100 years ago, they believed there were over 120, maybe even 140 so-called vestigial organs, whether it was the appendix, the tonsils, the thyroid, goosebumps. Now we understand that there's functions for all of those organs or structures that were assumed to be functionless. Now we see the same argument being applied to the genome. But no, we understand paper after paper demonstrating that endogenous retroviruses and are functional in determining cell types, functioning in gene expression, in embryological development. There's one paper that points out if we didn't have ERVs, we wouldn't exist. I like to exist. Hopefully the evolutionist likes to exist. And so these are necessary DNA elements. And I could go through for hours, papers and papers, discussing how we have these long non-coding RNAs, they're called, and they function and they coordinate with protein coding genes. And they are necessary to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. And so this starting point of design diversity that would make predictions on DNA function have actually come true. Right here, you can see a whole list of functions for the non-coding DNA. Maintaining genome integrity. We see a lot of redundancy in the genome as well. And that's evidence of forward thinking, which points us back to the forward thinker. Going back to our modes of transportation analogy, the evolutionists would look to something like a spare tire. They would say, oh, that's redundant, that's junk, that's just evolutionary baggage and leftovers. What they don't realize is if you're driving on the road and it's a winter day and the environment's bad and you get a flat tire, you're going to be very thankful that you have that spare tire in that situation. And so we see a lot of redundant elements in the genome as well. One gene that codes for a certain function, if it gets hit with a mutation and it breaks down, well, God's designed multiple versions of that gene. And so redundancy is great design. Here's several papers that go over pseudogene functionality. Your so-called pseudogenes, actually, a lot of them help to promote the function of their protein coding counterpart. And so you could take a screenshot of these and you can look into this yourself with a little more detail. And so many functions of junk DNA, mutational buffer, I talked about that, gene regulation. What's interesting is the endogenous retroviruses, they actually act as antiviral protectors in our genome. And so when viruses invade from outside, what's called exogenous retroviruses, like HIV is a famous exogenous retroviruses, we actually have these pre-existing designed ERVs that function to fight off these viruses. And it's very similar to how our computers have a built-in antiviral protection system. And so God has designed organisms in the biological world with these antiviral protectors. ERVs also function to fight off tumors. And they do this with a mechanism called viral mimicry. And so the cell is given the appearance basically of being invaded by a virus. And so now the immune system, which is, there's a superhero protein, it's called the P53 protein, and it actually mediates this process. It's very interesting stuff. And the immune system can target that tumor cell with damage and basically destroy it. But the interesting thing is the ERVs, they require their sequence similarities to your viruses in order to carry out their job, because they're trying to mimic. They're basically pretending to be viruses in order to carry out those function. And so when the evolutionist says, well, why do ERVs look like viruses? Well, firstly, they're assuming that if it's a virus, it's bad. You wouldn't want to live in a world without viruses. Viruses are extremely beneficial. They act in the ecosystem, and they also have many functions in our bodies. But the ERVs require those similarities to carry out their jobs. Okay, so with that out of the way, I know there's been a lot here, but now I want to get into some of just the amazing evidence for Adam and Eve, and then we're going to kind of wrap things up and hand it over to Matt. And so, as I touched on earlier, there's a little piece of DNA. It's called the mitochondria, and we only get this piece of DNA from our mothers. It's passed down intact from generation to generation. So, but it's not passed down on the father's side. So my daughter would have my wife's mitochondrial DNA. And this is why we call this DNA uniparentally inherited DNA. Now, like with all DNA, mutations accumulate in this DNA compartment. It turns out that the mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA, it's way faster than evolutionists ever expected. It's roughly 0.5 per generation. The evolutionists required a lot slower than that to explain why overall humans have very low variation in mitochondrial DNA. But anyways, as mutations accumulate, more and more branches on this family tree that we're looking at are created. Now, rather than the evolutionists where they'll take humans and then they'll take strawberries and then they'll take other mammals like whales or chimpanzees, and they'll connect them with lines. That's imagination. Evolutionists hope, dream, and imagine. What we're doing here as creationists, we're just taking DNA from humans and we're building this phylogenetic tree. So we're not incorporating strawberries and we're not incorporating chimpanzees. And so there's no assumptions involved. This is just worldwide mitochondrial DNA that is represented on what's called a phylogenetic tree. And so as you can see, it's very clear that all mitochondrial DNA go back to a single woman of whom we've all originated from. Notice that starburst pattern where it's just this explosion outwards. Where in the middle somewhere, we'd have that ancestor that we've all originated from being mitochondrial Eve. And so when represented on a family tree like this, you can tell that we've all originated from one woman. Variation in this DNA compartment is very low. And the mutation rate is too fast. And so it's very simple. To the evolutionists, we mutate too quickly, and there exists very low genetic variation, which means Eve would have had to live just thousands of years ago rather than hundreds of thousands of years. And that is biblical time. Friends, that is biblical time. That is exactly what we'd expect if we all descend from just a single woman, as the book of Genesis describes. Now, the same thing is true for the Y chromosome. And so this is a Y chromosome family tree now, where we've built this tree basically from Y chromosomes worldwide. And notice it's the same thing. All Y chromosomes, they go back to a central point. And you have that starburst pattern where there's an explosion, which is exactly what the Bible describes. You have Adam and Eve, and then Adam and Eve experience rapid population growth, exponential population growth. And so the genetic data is fully consistent with how Genesis describes the origin of man. The mutation rate in Y chromosomes, same thing, extremely fast. It's roughly 1 to 3 mutations per generation, much faster than the evolutionists have ever expected or predicted. I pointed out earlier that every single male Y chromosome on the planet is nearly identical. When you bring in the chimpanzee Y chromosome, it's amazing stuff. Because the evolutionists argue that the chimpanzee is our closest cousin. But it turns out that the Y chromosome of the chimpanzee, when you consider overall architecture, gene content, and size differences, is only about 35% the same as human male Y chromosomes. That alone refutes evolution. There's no way to account for those massive differences in the Y chromosome when all humans have a Y chromosome that's 99.999% the same, because we all go back to just a single Y chromosomal ancestor. And so again, the same thing that applied to the mitochondrial DNA family tree, we have mutations that occur every single generation. And so you form new branches on the tree. And again, you can see that all branches basically go back to a single person. right here, I could talk about this for the next 2 hours, very technical, but all I want people to recognize is your 3 nodes in the middle. So notice the 3 arrows. What this is called in technical terms is haplogroups. Okay, so this is the fact that all mitochondrial DNA goes back to 3 main groupings. What does the Bible say? After the flood, we have Noah, his wife, their sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. To the evolutionists, this is all just a coincidence. Wow, all mitochondrial DNA goes back to 3 main groups, 3 women. Exactly what the Bible describes occurred after the flood. Here's some sources for everybody, just demonstrating what I'm saying is true, is reality. And so even the secular literature admits that your observed mutation rate is 10 times faster than evolutionary rates. Hypermutation exists, and so mutation rates are not constant. Evolutionists have a uniformitarian assumption built into geology, built into genetics as well. Here's an example of what I talked about earlier. We got the chimpanzee Y chromosome. If you're looking at my cursor here, this is the chimpanzee Y chromosome versus the human Y chromosome. Notice it's half the size, the gene content's completely different. It actually turns out, breaking the so-called evolutionary nested hierarchy, the human Y chromosome is more similar to the gorilla Y chromosome than either are to the chimpanzee Y chromosome. But I thought chimpanzees were our closest cousin. And so this is just showing the inconsistencies and the breaks in the so-called nested hierarchical argument that the evolutionists put forth. I've got whole presentations on my channel just talking about the Y chromosome. And so I'm going to move through this quickly. Gene expression, even in similar genes between humans and chimpanzees, we share those genes. We have similar genes. They actually have big differences in the way they're expressed or the way they're regulated or the way their epigenetics applies to it. So even in the similar regions, there's differences. And this is all amazing evidence for separate ancestry. Real quick, I'll go through this. This is the secular literature admitting that every single generation, the human mutation rate, it's accumulating a lot of mutations. 100 new mutations per person, per generation. Michael Lynch, famous population geneticist, not creationist. He has a paper here titled Our Future Genetic Load. Guys, the genetic load doesn't allow for us to go back hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Notice this. In summary, the vast majority of mutations are deleterious. So if the vast majority of mutations are deleterious, they're also nearly neutral, so selection can't see them. What that means is they build up over time and they degenerate. Even your best beneficial mutations like sickle cell anemia, for example, that evolutionists can point to, when looked at genetically, they're the result of broken systems. They're the result of degeneration, the result of a loss of information. And so I've got a ton of slides here and a ton of resources that people can look to. Okay, so here's the last slide and portion before I hand it over to Matt. So we've dealt with endogenous retroviruses. Remember, the question is, are these really the ancient remnants of past viral infections, or are they created units of DNA function? Well, the fact that we have documented functions for the endogenous retroviruses tells us exactly why we have similar endogenous retroviruses with the chimpanzee, because the chimpanzee also requires DNA elements to function in gene expression, or to function in gene regulation, or to function in the embryo. And so we share endogenous retroviruses with chimpanzees for the same reason why various modes of transportation designed by Chryslers and Ford and GM have engines in common. And so ERVs are not evidence for evolution. Pseudogenes, we talked about pseudogenes earlier. They're not, yes, we do have some broken genes because of the growing genetic load, but a lot of what they call pseudogenes actually have known functions, known functional roles associated with them. And the last one they'll look to is the chromosome 2 fusion. So I've got some slides on that here as I wrap things up. Here's just a few papers that if anyone's interested, feel free to email me. I've got dozens and dozens that I go over in my book. And so this talks about how endogenous retroviruses protect us from viral infections. This one, notice this citation here in this paper. The placenta and the mammal. So they'll say if the accidental infection of a mammalian ancestor by an exogenous retrovirus, they're assuming that this infection happened. We would argue that it didn't. But they're saying if this didn't occur in their evolutionary story, the placenta and the mammals that produce it, including humans, would have never existed. In other words, what they're saying is we require the endogenous retroviruses to exist. And so thank God that he created us with these herbs. Paper after paper right here. Retroviral promoters in the human genome. Scientists identify new beneficial function of endogenous retroviruses in the immune system. And I've got about an hour and a half presentation on my channel and that I give to people who are interested on just endogenous retroviruses. And so I'm just really, really covering this quickly. Notice this. This is from the secular literature. They admit, far from being junk DNA, the pervasive retrotransposons that populate the genome have a powerful capacity to influence genes and chromatin. And the evolutionary community has really struggled to explain how these functions could come about, how they could evolve over time. And so this slide I've put together, cool story, bro. And the reason why I think this is funny is because the evolutionists, they will invoke just so stories to explain how these ERVs evolve these functions. And so here's the last argument, chromosome 2 fusion. Basically, in a nutshell, I've got an hour and a half presentation on just this as well. So I'm just going to cover this for about a minute or two. Humans have 46 chromosomes. The great apes have 48. And so to explain that discrepancy, because they start with evolution being true, they say, well, there must have been this unilateral mistake in the human line where 2 chromosomes fused to make 46 rather than 48. You can see the hypothetical story here on how that happened. Well, the problem for the evolutionists, and there's many problems. One major problem is where they believe the so-called fusion took place. There's actually a gene that overlaps it. I've searched the database for functions with this gene. The gene is called the DDX11L2 gene. And notice here, just look at the gene. You can look it up yourself, DDX11L2 gene. DDX11L2 has almost 2,000 functional associations. It actually produces a functional RNA. And so the question to the evolutionist, how do you get highly functional and essential genes by slamming together 2 chromosomes? Christopher Roop and I, Christopher Roop is the author of Contested Bones. We did some of our own original research, and we looked at the so-called telomeres. So telomeres are the end caps of chromosomes, and they're actually supposed to protect against fusions, but over time they degenerate. Think about your shoelace on your shoe. The way the plastic piece at the end kind of flares out over time. That's what happens at the end of your chromosomes with the telomeres. These end caps flare out and degenerate over time. That's one of the reasons why we age and die. And so they'll argue that 2 chromosomes fuse together. And the issue, that the problem is though, and Christopher Roop, a co-author of an article I put out, we made a prediction, and he looked in the database. He did an analysis of the human genome and looked for these telomeric repeats in a head-to-head organization in other chromosomes. And we found them in multiple chromosomes, but we found a very big signature in the chromosome 9. And so those telomeric sequences, point is, they don't represent the ancient remnants of fusions. They're functional DNA elements, and they're found all throughout the genome. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there. We've debunked ERVs, chromosome 2 fusion, and pseudogenes, and we've also provided just undeniable evidence for a literal Adam and Eve and biblical creation. So I appreciate your attention. Matt, we'll hand it over to you, brother.
Are you sure? I don't know if we have enough time.
Yeah, you got 12 minutes.
12 minutes. Okay. All right, here we go then.
Your screen's up.
I'm a real fan of predictions. The predictions that come out of the creationist camp, I'm astonished that more people don't know about, because it's really good news for us. Matter of fact, everything that evolution has ever predicted that's really large and very important has been completely wrong. And I think that's really important for people to know. We're going to go over some of them right now. But let's just stick, since I have 12 minutes, we're going to go over genetic boundaries, because a lot of people like to know where we can draw that line. And what is a kind? Where does evolution stop? What's preventing it? What's going on? Another one would be phenotypic diversity. And then is there a time limit on the genome? And so the first one would be phenotypic diversity. You see, the Bible mentions that there was a global flood, and then all the people repopulated Earth, but they went to one place at one time, which was the Tower of Babel, and from there they dispersed. If that was true, then people would have the same phenotypic diversity between all of us. Now, that's just a really fancy word for visual diversity. How different do people actually look? And when we do this with humans and primates, we see humans have massive amounts of phenotypic diversity, but animals do not. They have a very limited amount of phenotypic diversity. And it really doesn't matter what type of animal you look like. I just put primates on this one next to humans because that's who they say we're the most related to. But as you can see, humans have a massive amount of phenotypic diversity. But here's the thing about that. When you look and you compare different races of people, which there really isn't such a thing, you find a very similar contrasting thing. It's that the phenotypic diversity between all humans is the same, but it shouldn't be like that. If evolution was true, there would actually be a nested hierarchy, right? Africans lived in Africa for like, what, 150,000 years before the European and Asian even evolved, right? So why aren't Africans far more phenotypically diverse than the other groups of people that are on the earth? It clearly should be. The Bible mentions that after they got off the ark, people diversified, and we have lots of phenotypic diversity. And over time, as people groups die out, we lose phenotypic diversity. And that is kind of what we see. And of course, we go into extreme detail if there's time. We don't have that for right now. So I want to ask you, what makes more sense? Is it
actually, Matt, I'm going to stop you right there, brother. I just got a notification. Take your time. We can have extra time. So if you need an extra 15 minutes, go ahead. No rush.
Wow. Okay, great. So we're here looking at the Tower of Babel inscription, which was found on stone. If somebody drew it in with some gold so you can see it over the rock much better. So the question is, what makes more sense? That we would have and see a massive haplogroup of explosions, which just means that a mutation rose to fixation in small groups of people and exploded out of where we would say Babel is in the Middle East, and people groups formed, or the evolutionary paradigm where people lived in one continent trapped and isolated from the Sahara Desert for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe, and very few haplogroups even formed, even though Africa itself has one of the most diverse climates on Earth. So you would think if small people groups were living all over in Africa, that these haplogroups would be forming, especially over 150,000 years, yet that didn't happen. I think it best explained from our biblical model. It's the only thing that really makes sense. Then when we look and we say, this is our model, right? From creation to Noah's flood, bottleneck. Then people migrated to the Tower of Babel, boom, another bottleneck, and then population throughout the world. So that brings us to the next question, which would be genome studies, right? Is there evidence for this inside the human genome? Evolution would say that there is a missing link common ancestor that diverged into all of the primate ancestors, including humans. Well, what we actually find in the genome is indicative of exactly what we should find inside the creationist model, which is that Noah's Ark, global flood, all life, aquatic and land, reduced from 90% down to just 10%. And then those animals got off the ark, diversified, and humans as well. Well, guess what? That 2018 Rockefeller University study found exactly that. And they found something very unique, is that the species have clear genetic boundaries that they weren't expecting to find. That is not part of the evolutionary theory. Matter of fact, that's why they made statements like this. This conclusion is very surprising, and I fought against it as hard as I could. That tells you right there that their mind isn't able to process information that's contrary to what we've been told, right? If there's only one paradigm to believe in and there's something that's contradicting it, the mind has a hard time grasping that. So this is the Sweeping Gene Survey. This is an article that you guys can read online. It's not the study itself, but they just reduce everything for you. And they found that, again, 90% of all animal life, genetically speaking, is the same age. But they just can't understand how that could be. And this guy makes a funny point. He said, did herrings really pass through an equally recent population bottleneck and anchovies too? Like, how in the world could have all the fish died as well as land life? It doesn't make sense evolutionarily, but it makes sense perfectly in our model. So again, they wrote this debunks much about what we knew about today about evolution and species. Obviously, this was complete devastation for them. And so what they did is, at the heading of their own article, they had to write, this study, right here, this study is grounded in and strongly supports Darwinian evolution, including the understanding that all life has evolved from a single biological origin of life. No, it does not. That study completely destroys it. That's why they had to put that there, because everyone came to read about it and they're like, oh no, this can't be true. So what they did is, to try to confirm this, is they went to the fossil record. Well, they believe that the fossil record is true, so they went to where they believe 200,000 years ago was, and lo and behold, no bottleneck. They couldn't find anything to account for this extinction event that killed land life and aquatic life. Why? Because they believe in a made-up myth. They're not going to find what doesn't exist there. That is why the creation is true. That's why there's genetic boundaries. We can see them in genetics. And when you see these phylogenetic trees being built, the reason that they exist in this hierarchical pattern, which he covered a little bit earlier, is because when they look inside of genes, or when they look inside of protein coding regions or anywhere, for instance, this one's in mitochondria, they look and they see these nucleotide sequences, and they think all of those got there from mutation. But these are functional differences. And now they're starting to realize that, and they're actually able to put predictions based on function, based on these sequences alone. So they're proving more about the biblical creation model continuously, which is great news, because all this is doing is helping us more and more and more. That's why when we look, we found the genetic boundaries that existing between these different species. That should not be true. They should be finding something else. What happens when they looked at wolves? Well, guess what? All the modern day species came right from them. Those very two. That's why they say the dog origins from a single type of dog. It's just a wolf. That was it. You can see the very study itself right here. And that's exactly what we were saying. There isn't a convergence on some different missing link common ancestor, like between a bear and a dog, bear dog, right? That doesn't converge like that. We converge on the same kind. That's exactly what creationists have been saying. And this process is happening rapidly. This is why it says Darwin could not have imagined the speed at which we're actually seeing these things. Matter of fact, they're even talking about rewriting a new theory of evolution where rapid change and adaptation is actually happening. The two words are rapid radiation and punctuated equilibrium, where they make jumps and fast leaps, but that's not supposed to be the case. For instance, Darwin himself predicted, based on evolution, that a new finch species should arise once every 3,000 years. To his surprise, not creationist, is that the finch species actually arise once every 2 generations, literally every 2.2 or 3 years. Completely contrary to what he had predicted. And a lot of critics say, well, it's impossible. You can't take just one type of an animal and put it on an ark, have it get off, and populate the entire world. Inbreeding would kill it. That's not true, and we have observational evidence of that as well. On the Mouflon Islands, they dropped off just a single pair of sheep. They populated and grew out, exactly like the Bible says, by the way, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. If you're following God's command, you don't have a problem. But what happened is they filled the island. There was like 700, and then they maxed out their population size. They did the same thing with deer in New Zealand. Just a single male deer and 4 females were dropped off. Boom, it's one of the most invasive species on the island. They did the same thing with buffalo on Catalina Island for a movie shoot. Now the island is overpopulated with buffalo. There's not an inbreeding problem, and it's not an issue at all, and it's rapid. Here's another article where they did with fish, guppies, lizards, mosquitoes, insects, all different things. But they want us to believe that a Pachycetus, like a dog, bear, wolf kind of creature, in less than 1 million years became an aquatic creature. How can they get away with saying that when wolves themselves, as you can see in the upward limit here, have supposedly existed for 800,000 years, which is almost the exact same amount of time, 1 million years, and yet it hasn't changed at all. Phenotypic diversity on wolves and raccoon dogs across the continents are almost identical to one another. It just doesn't make sense evolutionarily. So that brings us to the next question. What is the shelf life of the genome? So over time, mutations build up. They build up in the mitochondria. The mitochondria can't get rid of them. It doesn't have a self-repair mechanism. And Dr. Nathaniel Jensen looked over and said, look at that. There's only 1,483 differences separating these humans and chimpanzees. There should be, if deep time was possible, an imagined up to 21,000. Which means that for the mitochondria, if it were to fill up, it would give it about 3/4 of the way. It would reach about 12,000 mutations, and it would be a saturation point, and it couldn't get any more. The mutations would start flipping over in one place, and you would see that. It would be its maximum limit, and no more mutations could occur, but we would see that. It would be like a hole in a bucket, and you filling it with water, and eventually the water starts pouring out the hole. You know how long it's been doing it because it's been there for a while, right? You know that the hose wasn't put there 2 seconds ago if it's coming out of the hole. Well, the same thing by looking at the genome. We can look inside of different regions as well. Here's the CO1 gene, which is a highly conserved region, yet we know from a bottleneck very recently that there's just 65 differences, which all occurred in the chimpanzee, really. And there should be a saturation point of 466 in this gene, which is only about 600 base pairs large. But yet we don't see that. We don't see it anywhere. So therefore, not a lot of time has passed. And the reason we know is because mutation rates are fast. So with a fast mutation rate and not a lot of time, you don't get a saturation. But if you add time, now you have a genetic problem, because we would be able to see that in the genome, and we don't see it anywhere that we look. So how do we know this is true? Well, because we can go and we can look at simulations as well. What you're looking at is a picture of the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health, which is the largest health organization on earth. And they use the simulation that was designed by Dr. Carter, Robert Carter and Dr. John Sanford, who created Mendel's accountant. You see, they don't care about the debate between young earth creation and evolution. They just care about what works because they're interested in helping people and healing them. They use a young earth creation model because it's what works. They don't use some made up evolutionary concept idea about how mutations might spread. They need to know exactly how they spread. So they use the young earth creation model. That should really make a critic think, right? Well, if evolution's true and these numbers are true, then obviously we can use them to some benefit. Well, they don't use them. They use the young earth creation model because it's accurate. It's what we see. It's what we observe. It's what we test. And it's what we make predictions on. You'll notice nobody's really taking up Nathaniel Jensen's challenge to pick an animal and base its mutation rate, because they know they can't do it because evolution is wrong. That's why there's books like this that have been written. Why haven't we died 100 times over? The paradox exists to the evolutionists because they have no answer for this, because they believe in deep time. They can't understand how this can be the true. And synonymous mutations, which are just another term for neutral, is actually not so neutral. They actually do create some problems in the body. You can't have that. That's not a good thing. And look at this. Around 200 to 400 generations ago, harmful mutations just arise out of nowhere. That's kind of peculiar. That doesn't match anything evolutionarily, but it matches our model perfect. And then again, we can see it over here. Scientists confirm that the human genome rapidly began diversifying not more than 5,000 years ago. Surprise, surprise, right? So again, what do we see when we look inside a mitochondria or any other of these regions in the genome that are accumulating mutations? We don't find that saturation point that we should if evolution was true. It matches creationist predictions down the line. So when we're going and we're comparing these and we're lining up predictions, which matter more than anything else, we find that we explain genetic diversity better, phenotypic diversity better, mutation rates better, or human origins, fossils, you just name it. You go down the line. We dominate all of it. And then what kind of examples do we get from the critics? We don't need evidence. We know it's true. That's what they say. They already have made up their mind that it's true, right? They're very dogmatic people. So I always say, just go right back, read through that list, compare it, and say, what did evolution originally predict? What did they actually say? Well, you can go to Charles Lyell, and he right out said, we got to free the sciences from Moses. They looked in his personal journal and notes and actually found that he was a huge fan of Lamarck. And he said that if we actually, he loved it, right? He said, if we actually push his arguments as far as we can go, we can get people to believe they evolved from the orangutan. And later, that became very popular. And the three fundamental types of all humans, they believe, actually evolved. Supposedly the white and the yellow, or the Asian and the black, evolved from the chimpanzee, orangutan, and gorilla. That was the concept and the idea at that time, all based on, with no science at all, just the concept of we got to get away from this creation stuff. We got to just throw something out there. The public will believe anything if you push it hard enough. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. And so Darwin went off of Lyell. He liked his work. So of course he went with that concept. And the only thing Darwin really ever got right is natural selection. And ironically enough, he plagiarized that from creationists. He got this one specifically from Edward Blythe, and another one he got from Patrick Matthew, which again, he plagiarized. He stole this idea from. So ironically enough, the one idea that he had that was actually really good, he just took from creationists. So I find that funny. He was also related to the Rockefellers, and the Rockefellers fund the public education system. They said, we don't want a nation of thinkers. We want people that work. We don't want them distracted and thinking that they have a purpose and a function. So today we get a lot of people that have a purpose and a reason that they believe in it so much. It's not because evolution does anything for their life. It's not like they sit at home and go, man, I just love that I'm related to a monkey and a chimp and a mosquito that bit me and the banana that I'm going to eat for lunch. They don't care about that. They just know that they spend a lot of time and money and education and they need to get something out of it. So instead of being embarrassed about it, they're like, no, we got to keep this narrative going. It's the income. It's where we're getting our grant money. Why would we throw that away? So again, going back to the predictions, it was creationists that predicted function in the genome. It was the one that predicted that the genome would actually have genetic similarity. It was not. Today, the number one argument used for evolution is genetic similarity. And that was actually a falsification of the theory. And we know because in 1963, it was Ernest Mayr who said it would be useless and completely futile to actually look and find and see genetic similarity in anything that's distantly related because deep time would have erased it. We found the exact opposite. We actually found what Henry Morse of ICR predicted, that all things would have genetic similarity because we have the same creator and he would have left his fingerprint of creation on everything. That's exactly what we see. And so they even admit no biologist had even the foggiest notion that such similarities could have existed between genes of such different animals. They admit it begrudgingly, but I think it's important for creationists to know. We have to know these things, right? Because so when they say, but we're so genetically similar to chimpanzees, the only answer is evolution. No, it's not. Your predictions were the exact opposite of that. So you can't use it as evidence. Matter of fact, the more you dig, the more you find discrepancies. They like looking at protein coding regions, specifically like cytochrome C. But if you do that, you get a hierarchy of a pig right before the orangutan or right after the orangutan. Well, how could that be? Evolutionarily, that doesn't make any sense. Matter of fact, it makes so little sense. They've been trying to figure that one out for a while. They're like, wow, that actually has 1% more genetic similarity. Therefore, there must have been a hybrid between chimpanzees that fell in love with a pig and they had an offspring. And that's why we share so many other physical similarities to pigs that we don't share with chimpanzees, like this list. That's why they got that nonsense, because to them, evolution always has to be true. And I like this quote: there is no theory holding that molecular similarity necessarily implies an evolutionary relationship. And molecular data that contradicts the idea of genetic similarity denotes relation as just dismissed. It's often dismissed. They just throw it away. Who cares? Just get rid of it. We'll look somewhere else and we'll find the hierarchical tree that we need to build. So we always say that a programmer doesn't start from scratch every time it's going to be designing a new program. What a waste of time that would be. You would use the information that's already there. So why would a programmer use a different source code for every piece of software rather than reuse the same framework and language for each application? It's obvious. Just like Donnie was saying earlier, we would create the same type of thing because that's what God does, and we were made in the image of God, so we replicate that. But as you can see from the E. coli network, it's highly more involved than the systems that we can create today. So I would say that, well, why is there any similarity at all? Well, I like to answer that in the design function. And I don't just mean the function based on how we look, but also how we're designed. How are we forming? How are we forming in the womb? Look at the human hand. It's designed the exact opposite of a frog hand. But yet when we compare these things genetically, we go, well, look at all the different varieties of frog hands. That shows you the genetic similarities that are going to be in frogs, and also the discrepancies, the more diverse they get. Why? Because it's functions. It's functions that we're looking at. Here is the human kidney next to the chimpanzee kidney. You'll notice it's more similar to the kidneys of a pig. Why? Because when we're forming, the kidneys are functioning completely different than it would be in a chimpanzee. But if they were our closest cousin, wouldn't the function be the same? Wouldn't our appendix be much more the same as a chimpanzee, which is used to break down plant cellulose? Instead, it's not. The appendix is much closer to a mouse, which is a secondary system for bacteria.
1 minute, Matt.
Okay. So again, we have the chicken and egg. What came first? We know it was a chicken. Matter of fact, we know it was 2 chickens because they had to be able to reproduce. Really simple logic here. We know the chicken came first, so the egg theory is destroyed. We know that genetic similarity is a creationist prediction, not an evolution one. So don't let them go on those rants. We know that when we're looking into human origins, they admit that it's a big mess. There's no consensus even between scientists. So don't let them think, well, consensus agrees to this, so you have to as well. Think for yourself. Science is about questioning, not agreeing. And then they want so much to find the next hominid from any scrap of bone that they are going to do whatever they can to get it, because that's where the money is. That's where everything comes from. And they admit right here that these hypotheses are nothing more than just so stories. So I guess that does it for me. I hope everyone liked, and I'm glad I got some extra time there. I needed it, clearly.
And Matt, let me say one thing to the audience, and I'm going to bring Kent back in. This was probably hours and hours and hours worth of material condensed into an hour. So I do recommend check out this book for sure, Special Creation. This is over 300 pages, and it touches on everything we briefly touched about here. Mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Noah, levels of genetic diversity, touches on Neanderthals, and also endogenous retroviruses. And so there's a lot more to find in terms of what we were presenting here. Dr. Kent, the science gent. Oh, let's make sure you're unmuted, brother. You're good.
Amen. Well, you're right. That was a whole lot of good information, but I felt like I was taking a drink out of a fire hose. When I first started doing my seminars on creation back in 1989, I kept reading and studying and adding more material. I used a slide projector back in those days. I kept adding more and more slides. Pretty soon I had 12 carousels of slides to carry with me everywhere I went. Finally, I realized I don't have to cram all this in 1 hour. Now my seminar is 18 hours. So
right.
Get it where people can get it. And that was great stuff. I would like you guys, if you could, send me your slides. You got some great stuff there I'd like to have. I'll buy them off you. All that research, you guys do all the work and I'll take all the credit. Real simple. Boot camp, what a blessing this has been, brother. Thank you guys. Keep up the work. I feel like I can retire. You guys can take my place now and I can go take a nap.
Well, you've earned it, Kent. You've earned it, brother.
Well, we have several more speakers, and then tomorrow night we do my Whack an Atheist to close out the boot camp. We're going to do Charlie Darwin, the guy who started this whole mess, and you're going to learn some surprising things about old Charlie. Okay, and anyway, we'll talk about that tomorrow. Thank you guys for so much. Now, Donnie, is your address up there? People want to get a hold of you to speak at their church or something, or to get your material, your videotapes. How do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I recommend going through our website. So you can go standingfortruthministries.com. You'll find all the contact information there. I've got people messaging me all day over cell phone or Facebook. So just look up my name on Facebook, Donnie Budinsky. I get questions coming in all the time. I can answer them that way as well. If you'd like us to come over and speak, whether it's in person or online like this, we can book an appointment. We can do that. We'd be happy to do it, Matt and I.
So standingfortruth.com.
Standingfortruthministries.com.
Standingfortruthministries.com. Okay. And ours is drdino.com. DRDINO. Come visit us in Lenox, Alabama. They say the world's overcrowded. Come see Lenox. It's not overcrowded. I'd love to have
the rumor is you saw a car pass by last week, Kent.
I think it was 2 weeks ago now. We had a car go by. Thank you, guys. Keep up the great work. Slow it down a little bit. And just plan on breaking it up in smaller pieces. That's all you got to do. Get our video series, get your videos on this. Folks, there's a war going on. Find something to do. How many kids are being taught this evolution theory every day in the schools within 500 miles of where you're standing or sitting?
Oh, man. So many.
Thousands and thousands and
thousands.
Now, Bob Holmes is here. He gets into public schools with his volleyball skills, and he gets to speak to the public schools. One-man volleyball team. Bob, what's your website or email? How do they get a hold of you? beatbob.com. Played 21,000 volleyball games by himself against whole teams. And he's only lost like 400. Got a 98% win rate. He played us here. We gave you a good run for your money, brother. I may be old, but just because there's snow on the roof don't mean there ain't a fire in the furnace, Okay. So anyway, we're going to try again if we get time. Thank you so much, guys. Keep up the great work. And there's a war going on, folks. It's fixing to get really, really bad on planet Earth. It's a good time to get busy and serve God. See you tomorrow. Bye.
Amen, brother. God bless.